This book was actually the most popular book.
And it's giving you someone's actual experience.
He felt the only thing he could do was to join one of the militias.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Better Read Than Dead, the Generation Liberty podcast, which is about our book club program where we will be discussing 12 classic books over the year. Today we are discussing George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, which takes us through George Orwell's time fighting for the POUM militia during the Spanish Civil War. Today, I am very pleased to be joined by Adam Wakeling, who is a historian, an author, a lawyer. He writes frequently for Quillette, so a man of many hats. So thank you for joining us today, Adam.
Great to be on the program, Renee.
And also in studio, we have Luca from our Generation Liberty team from Monash University.
Thanks for having me on.
Awesome. So, there's so much to tackle in this book, but I thought, as we have a historian in studio, that Adam, you could give us just a little bit of historical background of the Spanish Civil War where this is set.
Sure. So, Spain in the early 1930s was, like many European countries, very unstable with the Depression, with political problems. And then in July 1936, a group of nationalist officers within the army attempted to stage a coup and overthrow the Republican government of Manuel Azaña. The coup only partially succeeded, and the nationalists took control of some parts of the country, but not others. In other parts of the country, the Republicans fought back, and the country fell into a civil war, which was extremely brutal on both sides. Now, Homage to Catalonia, as its name suggests, takes place in the province of Catalonia, which is up in the northeast of Spain. Its capital is Barcelona, which is the site of much of the action of the book. And what happened in Catalonia was the army tried to take control, and a group of left-wing militias, mostly backed by the trade union movement, fought back and managed to take over Barcelona and take over the province. So there was basically a counter-revolution. Large numbers of people around Europe decided to go to Spain to fight for the Republican cause. Orwell himself writes in Homage to Catalonia that there was almost a thrill in every anti-fascist in Europe, because people on the political left at that point had seen, the government of Japan fall to militarists. They'd seen Mussolini take power in Italy. They'd seen Hitler take power in Germany. The nationalists had tried to take power in Spain, but had not quite succeeded. So here was a chance for them to draw the line. So a lot of people, many of them very idealistic, enlisted in what were called the international brigades, which were volunteers who travelled from around Europe to fight on the Republican side. In Catalonia, power had been taken over by this group of militias, were called the Council of Anti-Fascist Militias. And there, as Orwell describes them, there's a bit of an alphabet soup. There's the United Socialist Party of Catalonia. There's a group of anarchist organizations. And then there's this one organization called the Partido Obrero de Unificación Marxista, the Workers' Party of Marxist Unification, which is a sort of non-Stalinist or anti-Stalinist revolutionary socialist group. So revolutionary socialists who are outside or opposed to sort of the mainstream communist parties in Europe. And George Orwell, or Eric Blair, George Orwell being his pen name, in late 1936 travelled to Barcelona and enlisted in the militia of the POUM to fight in the Spanish Civil War.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And it is, when you're reading it, it does take a while to get your head around all the different groups and all the different factions that are going on during this war. But Luca, on a different note, this book was actually the most popular book on the book club list selected by our members. It's also the only non-fiction book on the list. Can you do you have a view why it was the most popular amongst young people?
Well, there's probably a little bit of a correlation there. Like the fact that it is non-fiction, and especially pretty much everyone's read 1984, pretty much everyone's read Animal Farm, and if they haven't, well, go read it. But reading something that's non-fiction, something that's less abstract, something that actually happened, I think it definitely captured my interest, which is why I said, yeah, I want to read this, because it's giving you it's real, and it's giving you someone's actual experience going through something like that. It's not just, this is hypothetical. It's not just a story like Animal Farm. It's something that actually happened. So going through that with someone who can write as well as George Orwell does definitely gives you a new perspective on someone's experience going through that. So
Yeah, I think I agree there. And Adam, just to give us even more context, where does this kind of sit in the timeline of George Orwell's life, this book?
Okay, so at the time these events happened, George Orwell was in his early 30s. He was born in 1903. So Orwell had something of a name for himself at this point, although he wasn't particularly famous. He was famous enough that when he joined the POUM, they advertised it. They said, look, this great left-wing English writer has joined us. And so they used that for their marketing. But he wasn't extremely well known, particularly outside sort of left-wing literary circles. So Orwell was born in 1903 in northern India. His father was a colonial official. He grew up in England. He didn't do well enough at school to get into university. So he decided to follow his father's footsteps and joined the colonial service. In particular, he joined the Indian police force and was stationed in Burma. He spent most of the 1920s in Burma. He had a very good life there. He lived as a police chief. He had servants looking after him. He had huge responsibilities. Interestingly, among them managing like the intelligence gathering and propaganda services of the colonial authorities in his area. But he felt all that while that he was taking part in an oppressive system, that he was part of the problem. And he talked about, if you read his essay, Shooting an Elephant, he talks about how it was the only time in his life that he was important enough to be hated by large numbers of people. And after a while, he said he couldn't do it anymore. He threw it over. He returned to England. He had no real career prospects. His family was horrified that he'd given up this really steady job, well-paid job in the colonial service with no plans. And he said he was going to become a writer. How many people, quit their jobs and say, I'm going to become a writer now and actually make anything of themselves. He wrote a few novels with sort of mixed success. Then in early 1936, Victor Galland suggested he should go to the north of England and look at conditions there in the industrial cities. So he spent early 1936 up in the north of England, looked at the mines, at the factories, at the places where the workers lived, and he saw in extreme poverty. Conditions in the mines were very dangerous. Workers were being killed. The mining companies seemed to sort of accept that as the cost of doing business. And so that's when he wrote the book, The Road to Wagon Pier, which became at the time his best-selling book. Galland's brought it out, and it was published at the time he was in Spain. Shortly after he provided Galland with the manuscript of The Road to Wagon Pier, the Spanish Civil War broke out. And even though he was newly married and had taken out rent on a cottage in the countryside, planning to just stay there and grow vegetables, he packed up and went to Barcelona. He said originally he was going to Barcelona as a writer, but when he got there, he said he felt the only thing he could do was to join one of the militias.
Yeah, it's good to know that background and how he got into that particular militia, because he doesn't really fully explain that in that book, in the book itself. And Luca, you kind of touched on this before, that this is a non-fiction book. But personally, I found whilst reading it that I actually had to keep reminding myself that this is non-fiction, not because it doesn't feel real or gritty, but because it felt so much like Orwell's other writing, and that I fell into this world just as much as I would fall into the world of 1984 or Animal Farm. And it's like you can feel his style developing. Did you find that whilst reading the book as well?
Yeah, you can definitely see the continuity between his style that he developed in that book. And then I think the way he wrote about his experiences in Catalonia, and then that carried through to his other characters and the other worlds that he created, which is I think why Animal Farm and 1984 have such like a sense of authenticity, right? Because I think if he hadn't gone through that, it'd just be like another writer kind of taking these abstract ideas, putting them together and hoping it kind of works out. Whereas with him, you can definitely see that his experiences he drew from those in order to create those worlds that later on, everyone knows about, right? Everyone knows 1984 and Big Brother and things like that, right? And it lends them a tremendous sense of authenticity. And especially reading 1984 again after having read Homage to Catalonia, you can really feel he's putting himself in the position of the main character in that. And he's writing about this world as if he's there. And I remember there was the part in Homage to Catalonia where he talks about his arm was injured and there was fighting going on, and then he was in the trenches, right? And he's just reading his book as there's all this fighting and death going on, right? That is not something you can get from the abstract. That's not something you can draw from ideas. That is you being there and having that experience, right? And the fact that that carried later on into his books, his other books, where in 1984 he goes through the daily life of someone who's living there, right? It just, that sense of, because he had that experience, you're also kind of vicariously having that experience. That definitely carries throughout the rest of his work.
Yeah, I really agree. And I felt that whilst I was reading this book as well. And Adam, talking about how the book is written as well, this is pretty much a piece of military history, or at least it depicts conflict very well. And you've written about war and military history. What do you think about how it's written as a piece of that, as something depicting conflict?
It's very, very good, as Luca said, for its authenticity. One of the striking things about Orwell's writing in general, and this book in particular, is he gives a real sense of the futility that he feels. He goes to fight. He arrives here, and at the time of the Aragon Front, the two armies, the nationalists and the Republican militias, or the socialist militias, were fighting in the mountains in the middle of winter. Neither side had the equipment, the arms to attack a dug-in enemy. So they basically spent their time trying to gather firewood, find food, and figure out how to keep their trenches clean. And one of the really striking things about Orwell's writing is the degree to which he draws on the senses, and particularly the sense of smell. There's actually a book called Orwell's Nose. I can't remember the name of the author, but he talks about how throughout his writing, the way that this neglected fifth sense comes up a lot in Orwell's writing. And it gives this real sense of reality to the writing, that he's not setting out to, to glorify the war or to make it sound like, this was a glorious struggle for freedom or anything. He just talks about how it was really, he was committed to the Republican cause and to defeating the nationalists, but how he felt this sense of frustration, futility, disgust, that all the time he was doing it.
Yeah, and to talk about the futility of it, he enters the war wanting to fight fascism, and then he spends most of the time, most of the book is kind of dedicated between the conflict between the POUM and the communists. So what would you say, like how Orwell's thinking changes between when he comes to Spain and then when he flees to France at the end of the book?
So one of the interesting things about George Orwell in general is that he wasn't a very abstract thinker. He wasn't really an ideas person. All of his writing across is quite practical. He writes about what he sees in front of him. And when he arrives in Spain, he says he doesn't really care about this mixture of parties that he's fallen into. It seemed to him kind of absurd. If you think about the film The Life of Brian, they parody the People's Front of Judea, the Judean People's Front. This was drawing on like European left-wing parties up to, through the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s that behaved like this. And that there had been these parties with slightly different names that were ready to others' throats over minor disagreements. And so Orwell arrives in Barcelona and he sees, the Marxist Workers' Party as opposed to the United Socialist Party, as opposed to the Workers' Confederation. And it seemed absurd to him. Homage to Catalonia, I think, is really the turning point in Orwell's thinking. The Orwell that emerges out of Spain is the Orwell of Animal Farm in 1984. And the reason for that is Orwell went in expecting fascists to lie. He said they were going to use propaganda, they were going to lie. He didn't expect people on his own side to lie quite so brazenly. One of the key points in the book is that the Soviet Union gave some support to the Republicans in Spain, not as much as Hitler and Mussolini gave to the nationalists, but some. That support came with strings attached. One of them was then that basically the Soviet-backed Communist Party would control the Spanish left. The POUM and the anarchists didn't want a bar of that. They wanted to do their own thing. They thought that they had set up a situation in Catalonia, which was the perfect revolutionary state that had achieved the left-wing ideal. Stalin and the communists had a different view, and over June of 1936, the POUM and the anarchists were brutally suppressed. All of the world's communist parties in the UK and elsewhere insisted that the POUM and the anarchists were actually secretly fascists, that there wasn't a disagreement in the left, that it was the actual left fighting people who were in the pay of the fascists. Orwell had seen people who had volunteered to go and fight. He talks about Bob Smiley, who threw over his university career in England to fight for the POUM, some of these people were wounded in action, some of them were killed, and then they were smeared by the communists as being fascists. And a lot of socialists throughout Europe accepted that. That anger at the betrayal of the POUM is what gives us sort of the dark cynicism of Animal Farm in 1984.
Yeah, I think you're really right there. And Luca, what do you think about how Orwell may have changed through this experience? One of the things I think that he maintains, however, like is a cynicism that comes later, is his faith in humanity. I think he maintains throughout this book, and it's still there at the end. Did you find that as well?
Yeah, he's realistic, but he's not, I wouldn't call him very pessimistic. He's still got that sense of, and it carries throughout his other works as well. He's still got that sense of, maybe there is still a way out, maybe there is still hope. Like bringing it back to 1984, I mean, the ending is rather tragic, but you've still got that sense of, it's not just a story about this big machine, but it's about the individual cogs within the machine, right? And it's about the individuals who are basically just trying to survive day by day. You don't go into the experience of what it was in the trenches and things like that in order to just say all these people bad, right? He's definitely trying to draw out this sense of like, there might be all these huge disagreements going on and there might be this wide scale sort of unrest, but you do have individuals who, are fundamentally can still be good individuals. Like at the very start, he talks about that Italian bloke that he meets, right? And he says, probably a good thing I never met him again. He lives rosy in my memory, right? Which is good because it means that even though he had bad experiences with people like that Italian person, right? He's still got a sense of, a good perception of what humans can be, what humans can do. Yeah,
I loved throughout the book his kind of descriptions of the Spanish people and just descriptions of little individuals as little pocket kind of biographies of little people throughout the book. And you can see that Orwell, beyond everything, even though he's, a socialist arguably at this point, he is kind of an individualist as well because he's so focused on the people themselves. And I think that might be his frustration with the left, is that they talk about the working class, but that they're actually going to go and talk with them and experience life with them. So I think that really comes through in this book. But you just touched on that, Adam. When Orwell returned to Britain, he found that the Communist Party was saying that he effectively worked for fascists, and also that there was a little bit of resistance to the publication of this book. And it wasn't a popular book. So do you think that had a big effect on him as well, that resistance to not only the book, but also to be almost called a fascist himself?
Yeah, it was, and as I've sort of said before, that was the thing that I think really inspired Animal Farm. So when Orwell came back to England, he submitted the book to Gollancz. Gollancz wouldn't publish it. The reason why a lot of publishers were reluctant to touch it was because it was seen to be undermining the struggle in Spain. That it was almost, he would be giving ammunition to the enemy if he published this book. He would vindicate all of the apologists for the nationalists. And the book, when it did come out, and unfortunately came out when there was already a glut of books on the market in the Spanish Civil War. A lot of people had gone to Spain, and some of them had sort of gone to the front for a couple of days, then raced back and written, this was my experience, a memoir of a fighter on the Spanish Civil War or whatever. And Orwell had spent the better part of 9 months there. So he was a bit slower than these people. The book hadn't sold through its first run of copies until Orwell died. Even after Animal Farm in 1984 were published, there were still first editions unsold. And the British Communist Party kept to its line that the POUM was a fascist organisation until it folded at the end of the Cold War in 1989. So it never changed its official position.
Well, speaking of, how you said the publisher wouldn't actually publish it, right? One of the things about George Orwell that kind of strikes me is he's very much not afraid to just call out people, right? Whatever side they're on. Yeah. And you wrote about this in one of your articles in Quillette. You talk about, it was an article called George Orwell and The
Inevitable Bias.
The Inevitable Bias, that's the one. And in that you go to great pains to point out that he's very much, he's very much, I don't care what side I'm on, I don't care which ideology I'm supposed to belong to. I'm still going to call you out if you're doing something that I believe is wrong.
Yes.
And in that, you also reference one of his essays called Notes on Nationalism, which I found interesting because the way that he defines nationalism is very much not centered around the classic notion of, patriotism and things like that, but it's about just ideology and your adherence to ideology. So what do you think about George Orwell and his struggle, I guess?
That is, I think, that the key point of the whole Orwell thing is this anti-nationalist. And the reason why he uses the word nationalist is because he's talking about groupthink, but the word groupthink didn't exist. It was coined after he died based on the patent in 1984. So the word that he needed had not yet been invented yet because he had not yet written 1984. And he talks about nationalism as being patriotism, but also commitment to your religious group, commitment to your political group. And absolutely, I think that Homage to Catalonia inspired Notes on Nationalism. The point that he makes in Notes on Nationalism is that this bias is inevitable, that all of us are in our own way partisan. We all like to think of ourselves as being independent thinkers, but we feel good when we hear good things about people we agree with. We are naturally more credulous to those that we agree with and support. We are naturally more hostile and skeptical towards those whom we tend to disagree with. And Orwell admits that he himself had this bias, and he was a very clear thinker, but obviously he wasn't a perfect thinker. You can see, if you read the full body of his work, you can see his own biases and prejudices at different times come through. But he was unusual in that in almost every group he fell into, he ended up criticising them. So he went into the colonial service, and he could not keep quiet about the fact that he thought colonialism was a racket. That's what he described it as, a racket. Obviously, you don't make friends in the colonial service if you go around calling the colonialism a racket. So he felt that he was living a lie. He goes back to live among middle-class English people. He felt like the sort of the sleepy conservatism of the rural English middle classes was ignoring the problems in the world. He talks about, in The Road to Wagon Pier, people who happily get coal every day, but ignore the fact that workers were suffering in the coal mines to get them that coal. So he complained about that and made himself no friends. He goes to Spain, he joins the socialist minister. He complains about the socialist movement, he makes himself no friends. By the 1940s, he was basically friendless. And while we all talk about, I love a person who thinks for themselves, I love an independent thinker, in practice, people don't like independent thinkers. Being an independent thinker and calling out everybody for their hypocrisy is an easy way to make yourself friendless, even today. So that is something I always find funny about Orwell, is that nobody really heeds his lesson. Among them are some of the people who hold up his banner the highest, are some of the same people who are most, can often be blind to their own biases.
I find that the term Orwellian is being used more and more these days, and it's used by different sides of politics, and definitely used in relevance to the term cancel culture, and what we're witnessing today, where books, parts of history, people are being cancelled for being offensive, or, to use kind of Orwell term, wrongthink. But do you think his name is kind of used too easily, and also it may be kind of revealing your own bias, that you kind of take up Orwell to defend you because it fits you conveniently at that time?
Oh yeah, it's easily, Orwell is unusual in that probably only the founding fathers of the American Constitution and Jesus Christ have more people in the Western world claiming to be the inheritors of his real political tradition. And you can see this, I can guarantee, and I think, as you've said, sometime in the next few weeks, maybe even sometime in the next week, somebody is going to publish an op-ed in a major journal or newspaper accusing somebody else of being Orwellian. Where Orwell is misused, he's used as a club, and often people who are not very familiar with his works will call out somebody and say, you are doing exactly what Orwell warned us against. I think Orwell is of more value as a mirror, like reading the whole body of his work to come to understand your own limitations as a thinker, rather than, picking up your copy of 1984 and bludgeoning somebody in the face with it. As I said, I think it's better that we treat Orwell understand that he had his own limitations and he was wrong about a lot of things. Up until the end of his life, he believed capitalism was going to collapse imminently. He writes, even as he's writing 1984, you can read one of his articles where he says capitalism has no future. He had odd prejudices. He hated vegetarians. He complained about teetotalers. You can read in The Road to Wagon Pier, he goes on this long rant against vegetarians. Why does he hate vegetarians? Don't know. It was his own bias. I think it's important that we can learn a lot from Orwell. We shouldn't treat him as being like this religious icon that we roll out to and pray to.
Yeah, I think you make some really important points there. And Luca, do you find that too, that he's too often brought up as this is Orwellian, or trying to use his name too much to kind of justify someone's own side? Have you recognized that as well?
Yeah, it's just really interesting. Every little thing now is like, that's Orwellian. It's kind of sad because there were very specific things that Orwell was railing against. It's not as if you can go around and just be like, this story is changing the lettering on something, therefore Orwell, right? Like there were very specific things, and a lot of the time, especially with books like 1984, I think people kind of jump the gun, taking things that are very metaphorical, but the way he writes them, like in 1984, he's got the dictionary getting smaller, right? That isn't necessarily a literal thing, right? It could happen, and it's kind of happening nowadays in different ways, right? But I think a lot of people take these kinds of symbolism and then jump the gun and say, see, this is exactly what's going on. Without, as you said, like understanding the full body of work and even his own progression, his own ideological progression, because he wasn't static. He wasn't the same, right? You might have read Animal Farm and then that's it, and then go, okay, this is therefore who he is as a person. He fits into this ideology. You can't really do that. It's disingenuous. Yeah.
Kind of wrapping up here, Adam, what would you say are kind of the main lessons to take from this book in particular of Orwell's, and why you would recommend people read Homage to Catalonia?
I think the reason to recommend people to read it is fairly an easy one. It's a very good read. Some classic literature is more accessible than others. Orwell is just a very good prose writer, I think both of you have said. Michael Sheldon, one of his biographers, says that his style is deceptively simple. If you try to write like him, you see how difficult it is, but he makes it look effortless. And you can see his progression as a writer, and from his earlier books, he really works hard to develop that skill. But there also, in terms of the historical context of the book, it's really, I think, important to understand, to see from Orwell's position, to understand, the challenges of these inevitable bias, the way that people will lie for the best reasons, the fact that just because somebody is on your own side doesn't necessarily mean that they are the right thing. And I think, as what Lucas said, you don't need to agree with Orwell on many things to appreciate the applicability of much of what he says.
No, I think that's some really good points. And Luca, why would you say specifically young people should read this book?
That's an interesting one, actually, because I was talking to some friends the other day, and we were just having a conversation about like the whole lockdown thing and stuff, right? And one of the points that kept coming up, wherever you stand on the lockdown, right? One of the points that kept coming up was how in Europe people were basically rioting when the idea was proposed, right? And whatever you think of that, it was really interesting that one of the things that kept coming up was like, I can't empathize with that because I've never been through a totalitarian regime. I've never had that kind of experience. So it's very hard to look at that and say they have legitimate reasons because, well, us in Australia, we've done pretty good so far, not gonna lie. Like we didn't have, Germany sweeping through, right, in World War II. Like we didn't have concentration camps and things like that. And
we got our democracy handed to us on a silver platter.
Pretty much, right?
Like the Americans in the Revolutionary War.
Exactly. So because we've always had that, I think there is very much a sense of, okay, we've got it really good, and a sense of complacency, right? That this is how it's always going to be, and it's never going to change, and we don't really have to worry because our systems are perfect and it'll be fine, right? And I think coming back to not just Homage to Catalonia, but all kinds of other books like that, it really gives you an insider perspective, right? Especially in a country like Australia where we've never had that sort of insider perspective. I hope we never have to have that, right? It definitely gives young people a window into, and especially because his writing is so accessible, right? It gives you a very sort of first person experiential window into what it's like living in those sorts of conditions and having to deal with all these parties going against each other. Like, it's one thing to say the commies were doing this, the anarchists were doing this. It's another thing to say, like, I walk into a room and this person's arguing with this person, they're about to have a fight, right? Two very different things. And experiencing that, or being able to vicariously experience that, is very important, I think, for young people to kind of be able to at least sympathize with a lot of the sentiments that still run very deeply in places like Europe. And I think that we should also be, worried about, like, we should always be worried about our freedoms and, making sure that we don't lose that.
No, I think that's a very good point. And to kind of wrap up the show, I was going to ask both of you for recommendations for our listeners and viewers of, if they enjoyed this book, what else you think they would enjoy and what else that you think they should digest alongside it. So, Adam, we'll start with you.
So the very easy answer to this question is, if you like Homage to Catalonia, keep reading Orwell. His other non-fiction books, Down and Out in Paris and London, The Road to Wagon Pier, are both very accessible and very important and interesting books in their own way. And his other novels, which are often neglected, some of them are a bit so-so, but I would say Keep the Aspidistra Flying and Coming Up for Air are both underrated novels.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And Luca, what would you recommend if the viewers enjoyed this book in particular?
You just kind of completely took all of Orwell's works, like, read everything. I'd probably go with a very different vein, but I think similar kind of messaging, I think. Demons or The Devils by Dostoevsky. Because in the same way, he kind of takes a very abstract ideological struggle and then sticks it with these people, which is something that Dostoevsky is very good at. Just taking something that's very abstract, putting it into these people and basically having them fight it out. And I think especially because Catalonia really focuses on the struggle within the movement itself. In the same way, Demons is about, like, how even in a group that is supposed to be, all on the same side, you can still have disagreements and you can still have you can still have fights and arguments and breakdown. So I think very much less accessible, very, very different style of writing, but I still think it follows in that same sort of vein.
Yeah, I actually was thinking when Adam was talking about how Orwell should be seen as more of a mirror and something for you to, like, reflect on yourself as well. Dostoevsky is very much like that. He's not telling you to go and fix problems out in the world. He's telling you to look into yourself and see the kind of flaws within yourself. And he definitely talks about how that kind of possession of ideology. So I think even though they're very, very different writers, reading them alongside is very interesting. And also I would second the motion for reading The Road to Wagon Pier, which I've just almost finished, I think, which is kind of just before this book. Gives you really good insight into Orwell's thinking before he even goes to Spain. So I definitely would recommend that as well. But I would like to thank you both for this very fascinating conversation today. It was very interesting to talk about Orwell and the Spanish Civil War and everything with you. So thank you very much. Thank you, Adam. And thank you, Luca. And Adam, I think you've got a book out right now. So I thought you might want to give it a little plug about where our readers could get access to that book.
Sure. So House of Commons for a Den of Thieves, Australia's Journey from Penal Colony to Democracy. So I would say that Australia didn't quite have its democracy handed to it on a silver platter. There was a bit of a political struggle at the time, and this book is about this struggle in particular, how to create a democratic society in a country which had the stigma of being populated by felons. And not just any democracy, but what turned out to be an unusually innovative democracy. The first election in the world to use government-printed ballot papers and ballot boxes, so where you turn up to the polling booth, you get given a ballot paper printed at the expense of the government, you go mark it and put it in the box, was held here in Victoria in 1856. The modern election is an Australian invention. At the moment, it's most easily available as an ebook on Amazon and Google Books. It is making its way out to bookshops, so it's certainly for sale in hard copy as well, but it's slowly rolling out.
Oh, well, definitely get your hands on that. And I think it's something that a lot of young people don't really know enough about and not taught enough in schools, is how we got the system that we have here in Australia today. And it's very important knowledge, I think. And Luca, could you just tell our audience how they could get involved with book club and become a member of Better Read Than Dead if they are not a member yet?
Yeah, sure. So if you just head to generationliberty.org.au and head to the book club part of that site, it's free sign up for members and it's $10 for non-members, and you get all kinds of cool merch. I think you get 3 books, 3 free books, which is pretty good for $10. And you also get a bunch of merch like stickers and things like that. So would definitely head down and check that out.
Yep, thank you for that, Luca. And thank you again both for this wonderful discussion. And thank you for watching another episode of Better Read Than Dead. I hope you tune in next time.